it's a great pleasure to welcome you to CUTS Adda. And in this program, that what we've been trying to achieve is to have discussions with persons who are engaged and involved professionally in policymaking, specifically on the bilateral front. And so let me begin by not only welcoming you, wishing you and your family a very happy new year, and also congratulating you for the release, the launch of the much delayed, long awaited Australia economic strategy. So welcome, Ambassador Wadhwa.
Thank you very much, Amit, and I'm personally very delighted to speak to you today. And really delighted that the Australia Economic Strategy report, which you said has been delayed, I agree with that. But, I've been working on this report now along with CI and KPMG over the past almost 2 years. And this was finally released on the 18th of November. It was good that Minister Piyush Goyal and Simon Birmingham were there in the virtual participation, along with a large number of stakeholders in the Australia-India relationship. So it was a very substantial event from that perspective. And I'm glad that this report, which has been prepared as a response to Australia's India Economic Strategy Report 2035, which was released way back in 2018, has finally come out. And during the preparation of this report, we engaged with hundreds of stakeholders in India and in Australia across various cities and businesses, think tanks, states, government ministries, and universities. I'm glad that it's finally out there. And both these reports, I'm certain, would complement each other.
When Prime Minister Modi visited Australia during his first term, it was considered by many to be a historic visit, and not simply because it was a visit by an Indian Prime Minister after almost 30 years. It was considered to be a historic visit for multiple reasons, one of which is that there was an extraordinary outreach that the Prime Minister of India extended towards his counterpart. And the issue of the FTA, for example, did come up. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and a feeling that it would be negotiated and signed very quickly. It's now been almost 6 years since that visit, and we are nowhere near conclusion, which really makes people wonder as to whether there is a follow-up subsequent to historic announcements being made. And to that extent, when you say that organizations like CII or FICCI or the Tourism Office have only one person or two persons looking after Australia, the question that really comes to mind is whether two countries, whether Canberra and New Delhi, actually take each other seriously. And it's not just the governments who need to negotiate and work on this, it's the actual stakeholders, our business and industry. And the resilience with which they perceive each other becomes extremely important. You mentioned also about China. If we look at the two-way trade between India and Australia, it's about $22 billion as per the 2019 figures. But Australia and China is $252 billion. So we're really trying to compare apples and oranges. How strong do you feel is the sentiment in India and in Australia among the business community to actually see a report of this nature realize its true potential? And I give you one example, maybe it's a bad example, but a CEO forum does exist, but it's completely non-functional. So how do we activate this interest between the two countries? Otherwise, the two reports are really going to be on the bookshelf.
Yes, Amit, I think you touched upon some very important points there, and I'll answer you one by one. First of all, the Prime Minister Modi's visit to Australia. I was there with him on that visit. I remember very clearly that we discussed the question of a free trade agreement at that point in time. And I must say that we had some very vigorous follow-up in the 2 years which followed that visit. Um, Vigorous in the sense that things had come to a situation where we were actually looking at 3 or 4 major issues which proved to be obstacles at that time. And they proved to be obstacles because of the domestic constituencies for some in India and for some in Australia. Then we started talking about the RCEP negotiations. And before we came to the RCEP negotiations, Australia realized the mood in India at that point in time to conclude this agreement was just not right, because India had started a review of its free trade agreements with the ASEAN countries at that point in time. And that review was ongoing. And, the feeling was that once the review is over, then after that, the Australian FTA would resume. Now, that never came to pass because quickly things moved, and Australia and India started negotiating together in the RCEP. So, again, the bilateral FTA went on the back burner. Now that India is not part of the RCEP, and specifically this report has identified specific sectors, like, for example, things like gems and jewelry, or railways, or textiles. Now, all these attract higher duties for Indian companies in Australia, obviously, because there are sources from where Australia can get similar products at competitive rates, even though Indian prices might be cheaper. And despite that, I think exports are increasing in these areas. But how much more can Indian companies do if there's a level playing field? And therefore, looking at it from that perspective, we have a situation where the policymakers in India now will have to seriously look at alternate sources with whom the free trade agreements will have to be opened up. Since India is not part of the major agreement like RCEP, for example, and there's an ongoing review of the existing FTAs as well. But there is a mood change, so to speak, in India, at least to look at that. In Australia, I believe, always looked at expanding its free trade agreements, and that continues till today. So that's why I say that there is this opportunity which has come up. Second issue, you rightly pointed out about the stakeholders. And of them, the biggest stakeholders are the big business, which I also pointed out earlier. Um, Australia-China trade and investments are huge. And they're huge because, they grew on the back of commodity exports from Australia into China, but gradually expanded into other fields. And organizations like the Business Council of Australia, which include some really big names in Australia, started engaging more and more with China. And that's why we've come to this mammoth figure. And this trade, how has its own momentum.
Thank you very much, Anil. I mean, like you, I believe that India-Australia relations would be a very strong strategic input to the geopolitical and the geostrategic landscape globally. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for this important report. And I do hope that we will see a robust relationship taking shape. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Amit.